You've reached the offices of the Solid Signal Podcast, and surprisingly, we're in. Let's get started. The week is October 14th, 2019, and this week I wanted to go back to basics and talk a little bit about ratings. Television ratings may or may not be as important as they once were, but I'll explain that after I kind of explain what ratings are. Ratings are not something official. They're not something the government puts out. It's not even something that everybody can agree on. And certainly it's not something that everybody agrees here in 2019 are important. Ratings are something that are put together by the Nielsen company, which used to be called AC Nielsen and Company. But, things change and whatever. And it's a way to give broadcasters an understanding of how they're doing. Using not terribly sophisticated sampling equipment. Nielsen has always been a little bit behind the times. You actually, the system determines who's in the room, what they're watching, and then reports all that back. I have to assume it's all done over the internet now. It used to be done over phone lines, and before that, you had to fill out a diary of what you were watching, which was a real drag, I gotta tell you. But today, I'm assuming it's reasonably electronic. The rating system turns out for every show on every channel throughout the country a set of two numbers, what they call the rating and the share. The rating is the percentage of people who are watching a particular show out of everybody in the country. So ratings are relatively low these days. You find a show that's a top-rated show is getting a 3 or a 4 rating. That means 3% of the people are watching it. And then there's the share, which is the percentage of people who are actually watching television, who are watching that show. Those numbers tend to be higher. To get a 10 share isn't that bad these days. Of course, back in the 70s and 80s, these numbers were a lot higher. It was not impossible for a show to get a 40 rating or a 60 share. Of course, there were only 3 or 4 channels back in those days, so that kind of explains a lot of that. But ratings also look at time. Starting, I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, the rating system started looking at not just what you were watching live, but what you had DVR'd up to 3 days later, and in some cases up to 7 days later. This is less important, and I'll explain why in a minute, but it is important data to have. It gives some idea of who's watching and whether or not a show is a hit, because a lot of shows are just DVR'd because they're in a bad time slot or because they compete with something else. However, people who DVR will tend to skip past commercials. And folks, this is what this is really all about. This is about selling commercials. Local stations and networks use ratings data to determine how much to charge for commercials. If the ratings are up, they can charge more. And if the ratings are down, where they're still going to try to charge more, but they probably won't succeed. So ratings haven't changed a whole lot since the days that there were only 3 major networks in the world, or I should say in the country. There are other ones in the world, not the important point here. But one thing that has changed is that we have the internet. We have massive numbers of cable and satellite channels, and we have lots of other things for people to do. They can play on their phones. They can stream video lots of different ways. And ratings for streaming video, a lot of them are done, by the way. The major networks, your ABC, CBS, Fox, even, HGTV, Discovery, that sort of thing, rely on Nielsen ratings of their apps as well. However, not as much. And I'm going to take a minute and explain why that is. Nielsen ratings are done using something called representative sampling. By creating a really good sample that represents the whole group. In other words, it's got the same number of different people of different races, ethnicities, genders, whatever. As a general population, you can use a very small number of people to predict what a very large number of people are going to do. That's the science, and it does kind of work. However, when you're looking at these streaming apps, most of the time you can get much better data than that. Companies not like Netflix, they completely ignore Nielsen because they know exactly what everybody's watching at any given time. They don't need representative sampling. they do their own. I mean, they get 100% of that data. They don't have to worry about whether or not it's accurate. And to some extent, every streaming app does too. Unless you have opted out of all the analytics that you can opt out of on your streaming device or on your phone, then they're getting that data. It may be anonymous, but they're knowing what everybody in general watches. And it's funny because cable and satellite systems are also in the same boat, because for the most part of the last 10 years or so, cable and satellite systems have been doing their own what are called insertion ads. This is a technology that actually goes back about 30 years to radio and television, where the local cable and satellite company is actually putting their own ads in over what is actually broadcast. And when they do that, they can make more money. And again, they get incredibly detailed data about who is watching what. So the ratings aren't as important to them. An advertiser who wants to look at ratings data can get that kind of ratings data from Nielsen, but also is going to get it from AT&T or Dish or Comcast or whatever. So the question is, where does this leave the Nielsen organization in the future? And I've been kind of asking that question on the Solid Signal blog for about 7 years, because I think that they're really they've almost obsoleted themselves. At one point, they were putting out the message that broadcasters shouldn't go to HD because people didn't care. While that's partially true, it really wasn't the message that needed to be sent out at the time. And more importantly, there were a lot of things put up by the Nielsen organization that said, oh, don't worry about streaming, don't worry about cable, don't worry about satellite. You're still getting the same audience that you always have. And that, of course, is not true. One of the statistics I like to quote is that the highest rated program in 2018 got lower ratings than the lowest rated program in 1980. And of course you understand why, because there's the internet, there's YouTube, there's a million other things to do. But this constitutes a big problem for local broadcasters who want to start charging more and more and more when people are watching less and less and less. Yes, I pick on the Nielsen folks because I think that they've enabled broadcasters, and I think that their technology has been behind the times a lot. But then again, I have to admit, I'm not a member of that organization, and I don't have the kind of detailed information that perhaps I should on that. I'm just one blogger out here kind of trying to make a difference, and that's just my opinion. That's about it for the Solid Signal podcast for this week. I'll talk to you more next week.